And we are live, I think, if everything works as planned, which I hope, as always. Welcome, David Vine. That's very nice. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you. Um, it seems that we planned this conversation quite in advance, and at the time, the event unfolding lately in Ukraine were not happening yet. So I think we cannot really avoid that topic to start with, to be honest. And here in Europe, we don't really talk about USA in this conflict. It seems to be all about Russian imperialism. So maybe to start, you can please say something about who you are and what you do, and maybe we can start then after with this subject.
Sure. So I'm a professor of social cultural anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C., which, as I see it, is the what I often refer to as the belly of the beast that is the United States empire. And that has been the subject of my research now for more than 20 years. I began doing research by focusing on one military base in the Indian Ocean, where the United States and British governments created a very large military base by kicking out the entire indigenous people. And this opened my eyes to the really an entire world of hundreds of US military bases that encircle the globe and have encircled the globe since the end of World War II. That led to a series of books, one called Island of Shame, about this one military base on Diego Garcia and the expulsion of the local indigenous people. And then a book called Base Nation, about the global collection of now what are around 750 US military bases outside the United States, some of which, of course, Russia and Putin, that is, has been quite upset about in Eastern and Central Europe, in addition to hundreds of bases in Western Europe that, again, have been there since World War II. Most recently, I wrote a book called The United States of War, which traces the long history of the United States empire and the long history of US wars from independence, independence of the United States to the present, including the last 20 years of what in the United States is often called endless war or forever war, that followed the attacks of 11 September, 9/11 is called in the United States.
Mm. And yeah, the number you are giving are impressive because it's really something our media never talk about. I'm not even sure there's bases in Switzerland. Probably not, but there's 30. You said 30 countries are involved in the building of bases of USA.
So dozens of countries have been involved in the construction of US military bases outside the United States over time. But currently, there are about 750 US military bases in 80 countries and colonies around the world. It's actually more than at the end of the Cold War, when there were about twice the number of bases. There were about 1,600 US military bases outside the United States in 40 countries and colonies. So since the end of the Cold War, the system, the network of US military bases has
Reduce.
shrunk considerably, but the breadth has actually grown. It's, again, doubled. And some of them, while they're not in Switzerland, they're quite close to Switzerland, just over the Alps, and in Italy, in Aviano, not far from the Swiss border, as well as in Vicenza, town near Venice, Italy. There are scores of US bases in Italy still, as well as more than 100 US military bases that remain in Germany, again, even though we're more than 30 years past the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, we can come back to Germany a little bit later, but I wanted to know, why would any country allow a foreign nation to have military forces on their own soil? It's, to me, it sounds like we are giving away our sovereignty. That doesn't seems right.
Indeed, and that's the way many people feel about foreign military bases. And I always encourage people, wherever they live, to think about how they would feel, whether they're a US citizen or a Swiss citizen or someone living in another country, to think about how you would feel living next to a foreign military base and foreign military personnel, even if it was a friendly nation. As is often the case for US bases, they're located in allied nations for the most part. There are some legitimate reasons why a nation would invite another military onto its soil. For example, during World War II, Britain invited US military personnel, US bases onto its soil to protect against the threat of Nazi Germany. And the US waged much of the war in Europe from bases in, at least initially, in Great Britain. So there are circumstances in which host nations want a foreign military presence on its soil. Although I guess I would say that in many of the cases where you see US military bases today, these are not democratic states. In fact, in at least 40 countries and colonies, these are undemocratic hosts. So it's really a matter of governmental and economic elites deciding that it is in their individual, often, or corporate interests to have a US military base on their soil. In many other cases, US bases have been on foreign soil for so long, they have just become entrenched in the landscape. And it's once a base is established, it becomes very hard to remove it for a whole variety of reasons. So there are complicated reasons why foreign countries invite or still have US bases on their soil. But I think it's important to point out that pretty much anywhere you find a US military base today outside the United States, you see opposition. You see people who would like to see those bases go, or at least be shrunk dramatically in size.
Mm-hmm. Are they paying also? I was wondering, if you want a base in my country, do you have to pay for it?
It's a great question. There are a range of relationships. In some cases, the US government has paid for the right to build a base, including the island I studied in the Indian Ocean, Diego Garcia. The US government paid $14 million to the British government to build a base on Diego Garcia and get access almost in perpetuity, as well as to get the British government to do the dirty work of removing the local indigenous Chagosian people. Djibouti on the east coast of Africa is another case where the US government has paid. In some cases, the host nation actually pays the US government to be there. Kuwait, South Korea, Japan would be a few cases. During the Cold War, Germany and Italy paid a goodly amount, as did, I believe, the Great Britain. But over time, host nations have often pushed back and said, we're not going to pay anymore. Although they sometimes still we would say, pay some of the bill by providing security for these bases on the external part of the base, or providing cheap utilities, electricity or water. So there are a variety of ways in which local people pay through their taxes for the presence of a US military base. Again, this is some of what, in the eyes of many, is so frustrating about having a US military base on the soil, in addition to giving up sovereignty and often turning yourself into a target. US, there's now a US base in Poland, which has been the source of some of Putin's anger. That base is now a target of Russian military forces. I'm not saying it's currently under threat, but it certainly has to be part of the war plans of Russia and any other nation.
We can easily understand the strategic advantage that having so many bases, you said more than 750 bases around the world have. But can you tell us about the specific of what a base is for? Is it like for troops, for materials, for information, for all of them? What does like a normal bases looks like? Base.
It's a great question. bases come in many shapes and sizes and have many different functions. But that was essentially my question when I began my research. Why does the United States have so many bases around the world? What are they actually doing? Are they protecting the United States, as some US leaders have said for a very long time? Are they protecting the people and countries where the bases are located? Are they providing peace and security? By and large, I found that they are not, and that the United States has maintained hundreds of bases unnecessarily that are frequently actually undermining US national security and then undermining global security in a variety of ways. But bases, they range in size from very small bases with maybe a few hundred troops and perhaps a launch pad for drones or small aircraft, to much larger bases that you still see in Germany and South Korea and Japan and Italy that have thousands of US troops, as well as often family members. They look like small or really not so small US American towns. The base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, that many people around the world are familiar with. People think of the US prison at Guantanamo Bay that the George W. Bush administration established at the beginning of the post 11 September wars. The prison there is just a small part of a much larger base that looks like a US town just dropped onto the southern coast of Cuba. And that base has been there since around 1903, like several other bases that have been there for not just decades, but more than a century. So bases look like many things. They play many different functions. They house, in addition to, of course, troops, high-powered weaponry, often nuclear weapons, as I think it's important for people in Switzerland to understand. The base at Aviano almost certainly possesses nuclear weapons, again, not far from the Swiss border, as well as likely several other bases in Italy and certainly bases in Germany that also house nuclear weapons, in addition to the whole array of other US weaponry.
Mm. That's worrying to be to be the least. Um, you is it a practice that every army in the world have to have bases elsewhere, or is USA the only nation who actually has this strategy? If you look like China, which we say is another big power in the world, or Russia, do they have bases in other countries to the extent of the USA?
Yeah, this is another important question. The United States has more foreign military bases, more bases outside its own territory than any nation or empire or people in world history, by all accounts. There are some other nations that today have foreign military bases. Russia has a few dozen. It's very difficult to actually define what constitutes a base. So the numbers, when I say there are about 750 US military bases abroad, I say about because the Pentagon itself, that is the organization that controls the US military, the US military itself doesn't know how many bases it possesses. And because it's difficult to define a base, the numbers become complicated. But
I've heard that the military even asked you to give like precise number because they lost count, and because you're working on it for so long, you are now becoming like intel assets for the military.
Well, I've never undertaken my research to become an intelligence asset for the U.S. military. Quite to the contrary.
I believe you. I believe you.
Yeah, no, a critic of U.S. military policy,
Sure.
but indeed, one of the research arms of the US military used my list of bases that I've been keeping for almost a decade when they were conducting a research project, rather than looking at the US military's own list, because it's widely acknowledged as incomplete. But back to your question, indeed, Russia has a few dozen military bases outside Russian soil. Mostly in the former Soviet republics like Belarus, as well as bases in Syria, not just since the start of the Syrian civil war, but I explain and others explain much of the Russian involvement in the Syrian civil war because they wanted to hold on to a long-standing foreign military base that dated to the 1970s and under the Soviet Union. China has just a few foreign military bases, a few in the South China Sea and one in Djibouti, where actually several other countries have foreign bases. Britain and France are the other countries that have the most foreign military bases, around the same number as perhaps Russia. Britain may actually have over 100, but again, numbers are hard to define. And then there are a few other countries, mostly in the Middle East, including Israel, that have some foreign military bases. Turkey does as well.
Are there a relevant map where we can trace these bases? Because online I've seen many maps, but you're the expert, so maybe you can tell me and I can find a map and maybe put it online? Or does it exist?
I've been, again, tracking US bases now for almost 20 years and have produced a series of maps showing how the global collection of US military bases has changed over time. And anyone listening or watching can find them at my website, which is basenation.us, basenation.us, where there are, again, maps of US bases abroad available for free download. Maps of other countries' foreign military bases, again, Britain, France, Russia, and the few Chinese bases are a little harder to find, but I could certainly point you in a direction. And actually, I will put a link to the best sources for those maps on my website, basenation.us.
Great. I'm actually now showing trying to show, wait, here we go. I'm showing the map of 2015 of the US bases. Maybe it's a bit small, but we can see there's a lot of these bases around Russia and also China. So maybe that's a gate to talk about the event of the war in Ukraine now, because I think there's some history of provocation and bullying. It seems to be forgotten because now everyone is panicking, and apparently there's also a very big double standards here in Europe, because and also very racist statements were made. The way European see wars suddenly change from one day to another, because there's so many wars in the world, but no one really seems to care because the skin is probably darker than the one in Ukraine. That's part also of the problem. But yeah, maybe you studied the history I've seen of USA and its 224 year of existence, and they were at war for all but 11 years, right?
The US military has indeed been involved in some form of war or other military combat in all but 11 years, and it's almost 250 years
sickening.
Of history. It is sickening. And I wrote my book, The United States of War, and my other books because I am sickened and ashamed at the history of US wars and the damage that not just US wars have done, but also things like the creation of the US military base on Diego Garcia and the expulsion of an entire people that took place because of US government officials' decision to build this military base. The track record, the history of US wars and US war making is indeed sickening. I mean, I feel that way about all wars, and there are many other countries who have fought many a war in the same period of time. And I do think it is important to oppose all forms of militarism and imperialism.
I'm sure that if the war in Yemen were meeting the same level of outrage, sanction, and measure to counter it, the war would be over for a long time now. So I'm not saying it's wrong to be outraged about the Ukrainian-Russian war, which I think there's way more parties involved, but I wish that we would do the same for all the wars, and it doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, I agree completely. I fear, I've been uncomfortable that there has been what seems to be a kind of self-righteousness among many people in the United States and surely in parts of Europe too, especially Britain, you know, expressing outrage about Russia's invasion and war in Ukraine and Russian imperialism, and seemingly completely oblivious to the history of US and NATO-led wars in the last 20 years, most prominently in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also in Yemen, not all of NATO in the case of Yemen, but the United States has been a major backer of the Saudi-led war in Yemen, the war in Libya, the war in Somalia. The US, you know, the principles of international law of non-interventionism that US government officials are now talking about Russia, Putin as having violated. These are principles, of course, that the United States has violated again and again with deadly, deadly effect. And I hope that, I mean, the kind of empathy one sees in the United States and Europe and around the world for the people of Ukraine is important. And but I hope that people in the United States in particular, because we have been behind some of the deadliest wars in the last 20 years, I hope that we could bring the same empathy to examine our history of war and the people who've been the victims of those wars.
Yeah, absolutely. So all these bases around Russia and China, do you think they play a role in the building up of the violence in that specific case?
In the case of Ukraine,
yes,
I think they certainly have played an important role in ramping up and increasing tensions and kind of militarization between Russia and the NATO and NATO-aligned countries over the last 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, more than 30 years. I think the United States and NATO have increasingly encircled Russia and brought their bases and military forces closer and closer to Russian borders. This does not excuse, of course, Putin's invasion or war in Ukraine. But I think they are part of the context and part of what has been a really failed foreign policy, international relations strategy of the United States and its NATO allies. That after the end of the Cold War, a war that was really in no ways cold because of the millions of deaths that war entailed and the risk of catastrophic nuclear Armageddon that would have affected the entire world, including Switzerland and countries that were non-aligned. We survived that so-called Cold War in some ways just by luck, and then had a chance to make the world a profoundly more peaceful place, and basically threw that opportunity away. I still think it's not too late to prevent a second Cold War, but we are in an extremely dangerous moment in my mind, where the United States and its allies run the risk of fueling another Cold War with both Russia and China. Cold War that, again, could bring nuclear Armageddon, nuclear catastrophe to the entire globe, could end life on Earth. And we have the existential threat that is global warming, climate change, but there is in many ways an even more immediate existential threat in the form of nuclear weapons. Any military confrontation between Russia and the United States or between China and the United States runs the risk of even accidentally becoming a nuclear conflict that could end human life on Earth, or the vast majority of human life on Earth. And that's something that should scare all of us, including, I'm sorry to say, people who don't live in the United States or Russia or NATO countries. This will affect all of us, and we should be quite worried at this moment and do everything we can to bring about a diplomatic solution to the war in Ukraine as quickly as possible.
That's where the media and the information has to play a role. But to be honest, what I see and read is kind of everyone is putting his I don't know the expression in English, but is oil on the fire. Is adding to the fury and the hatred. And obviously, I understand the emotion are the highest. I mean, the war is probably the worst event humanity have to face. But then, because it's the worst we can face, then the only way is to try to stay sober and to do everything to find peace again. But when I hear or see these leaders from all the sides, and sometimes also the media and the people, they're just calling for violence. And I don't think they realize that actually this time we are dealing with much bigger risk there. We're talking about, like, the red button, as you just shared. I've heard today, I don't know, because with all this propaganda, it may be wrong, but I think Russia issued a report saying that the West think we are in a cold war, but we are now in a hot war, not cold. And this is a really bad sign.
It is a really bad sign. The United States and NATO countries are shipping large amounts of weaponry to the Ukrainian military and are becoming de facto combatants in the war in Ukraine. And we are in a very dangerous moment. I need to do everything we can to bring down the tensions and make sure that this war doesn't escalate into a wider war. And I think indeed people in the media are often not playing a very helpful role. They're inflaming anger. And I think many of the people calling for more military escalation are people outside of Ukraine who aren't living through the war itself. They're people who in most cases haven't experienced war and have no idea what war really means, what kind of death and destruction war can bring and does bring. And I think we need a much more calm reaction. I think that was much of the mistake or series of mistakes that were made by the United States government and US leaders after the attacks of 11 September 2001 came because people acted in from a place of fear and anger and outrage. And this paved the way for horrific wars. And I think it's just for those who don't know, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan was a war that crossed over into Pakistan, the war in Libya, Yemen, Somalia. These wars have taken the lives of, by my estimate, around 4.5 million people. 4.5 million people have died in the US-led wars since 2001. I think very few people in the United States are aware of this, and that includes people who've died directly in combat, civilians and combatants, military personnel, as well as people who've died indirectly because of the disease that war causes, because entire public health systems, hospitals, sewage systems are destroyed and cause then disease and other forms of death. 4.5 million people. Meanwhile, 38 million people have been displaced in these wars, 38 million people, as well as tens of millions who've been injured by these wars. And that's what we're talking about. And again, for those who might be calling for direct US military involvement or direct NATO military involvement, I think they cannot, or are clearly not paying close enough attention to the kind of death and destruction that would come about if Russia and the NATO alliance were to come into a direct military confrontation. There we would be talking about tens of millions, if not more, dead. And that should just be incomprehensible and unthinkable.
It's not a question of surrendering, it's a question of being sane and understanding the forces at stake here. I was very surprised because Switzerland normally is proud to call itself neutral. And we kind of broke the rank lately because we now fully accepted the entire sanction that Europe put on Russia, and we are sending not weapons but material to Ukraine. And I mean, I understand some people say, well, if the international law is not respected, then it's not a question about neutrality to act against it. And I'm like, okay, I agree, kind of agree with that. But how many wars USA is fighting right now? How many are they? How many countries are they involved in right now? And I don't see Switzerland putting any kind of sanction against this blatant infringement of international law on that side. So then, to me, these double standards show that it's just political, and therefore we lost our neutrality. But I don't know. What's your assessment on that?
Yes, indeed. U.S. military personnel are perhaps in as many, well, since 2001, U.S. military personnel have fought in at least 25 countries. Currently, because of the lack of transparency, it's hard to know how many wars the U.S. military is involved in currently, but certainly in at least Yemen, Somalia, probably still in the Philippines, Syria, still in Iraq, among others, including in parts of Africa. And yeah, I think we're talking about politics, and I think we're talking about power. And that's why the Swiss government has reacted as it has, as far as I can tell, not being an expert in the slightest on Swiss politics or the actions of Swiss government officials. But I think that said, I think there are ways in which countries around the world can play a productive role in bringing about an end to the war, Putin's war. Again, I think we really should talk about Putin's war rather than, attributing this war to all the people of Russia, when it seems pretty clearly to be the action of largely one person and perhaps some of his closest allies and supporters.
He's the one who made the decision. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, sanctions are complicated because I think they give people the feeling of doing something, and we do need to put pressure on Putin to end the war and withdraw Russian troops. But often the people who suffer most from sanctions are not the wealthiest, like Putin and Russian oligarchs. Those people are well insulated from the effects of sanctions, and the damage wreaked by sanctions often falls on ordinary folks, ordinary Russians, or in the case of longstanding US and international sanctions against Iran, they've fallen on the backs of Iranians, ordinary Iranians, rather than government officials. So I think we need to be as careful as possible to make sure that people being punished are actually those who are responsible, and that those any forms of sanctions and other are actually likely to be effective in putting pressure on Putin to end the war.
Yeah, let's see what it's like, but I'm kind of afraid that now the bear is hurting, and then he's going to double down because he cannot really back off. It's kind of a circle of worse and worse and worse. So what do you think? You were saying, like, what do you think the different countries should do, like make like radical diplomatic efforts to bring the people on the table? That's one I think would be useful. Another one, there's this idea of calling an assembly to redesign the borders of Europe, basically, to think about with all the parties involved and to discuss. I don't really see any other issues. It's like, anyway, at one point they're going to be talking, so do it now and avoid death and suffering and destruction. Don't wait until everything has fallen down in order to talk, because at the end, even World War II, people talked, but I understand that the shift of power can lead after the war, if you kind of win militarily, can be pulled in one way or another. But I think humanity is losing at the end of the day anyway. And I was hoping in 2022 would be smarter, to be honest, but we're not.
Well, I wouldn't say we as and attribute it to all of humanity, because there are some very powerful people, government leaders, who I think bear most of the blame. I mean, I think to some extent, all of us or humans have some responsibility in
We
putting
elect these
pressure on.
people.
Yeah, when we live in a democracy or something approaching a democracy, we have some control, but I wouldn't, yeah, I'd be careful about attributing anything to humanity as a whole when there are some very particular individuals, mostly men, who are screwing things up. And I think this is a moment, as you were suggesting, where government leaders, backed by the pressure of citizens, or need to focus on finding diplomatic solutions, which include addressing borders necessarily, certainly in Ukraine and perhaps other places where there are frozen conflicts that are actually quite dangerous. And I think a diplomatic solution also has to address the role of the US military in particular in Europe. The US has a major military presence on the continent to this day, tens of, now probably around 80,000 US military personnel in Europe, bases throughout Western Europe, Central Europe, and Eastern Europe that have not been playing a constructive or helpful role, that have led to Putin feeling encircled and threatened. And of course, that's what military bases do. They are meant to be a threat. They're sometimes portrayed as just there to keep the peace, but when they're clearly aimed at another party, in this case Russia, for US bases, Russia's going to feel threatened. So the withdrawal of the US military base from Poland, for example, I think would be a constructive step. Even more immediately, I've since before the start of the war, I was calling for the United States and NATO to guarantee that Ukraine would never be a member of NATO unless Russia as well were a member of NATO.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that should be. I think there's great reason to doubt the need for any NATO at all. But if it's going to exist, it should be an alliance that is not aimed at any adversary like Russia. Instead, we should be looking to incorporate Russia and Ukraine into the alliance as part of an effort to create a world in which we don't need military alliances. Let me just also say that this is a moment where we face extraordinarily grave dangers in this world, beginning with global warming and climate change, as well as gross inequality between the global north and the global south, and as well as inequalities within nations, global pandemic and other possibilities of pandemic diseases. These are the kinds of threats and dangers that as a world we need to be taking on. War is only distracting us from taking on these dangers that are endangering all of human existence, and stripping literally trillions of dollars away from efforts to confront and solve the real problems facing all of us.
Well, that's quite bleak, to be honest. But let's go back to the book you wrote, The United State of War. When you're a nation that had been at war for 13 years out of the 224 years of its existence, then are there not reason to doubt that USA is actually not trying to de-escalate this conflict, but to actually make it happen? Or is that conspirational to say that?
I've seen no evidence that US government officials were trying to make the war happen. Now, that's not to say that hasn't happened in the past. In fact, there's evidence that the US government, prior to the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, actually encouraged that invasion. I don't, again, I've seen no evidence to show that the US government encouraged this war. However, I don't think the US government's efforts at diplomacy were ever serious efforts. I think the US government laid down a position and showed itself to be totally inflexible and basically said Russia had to accede to US and Ukrainian government demands. And that's not diplomacy. Diplomacy involves each side having to give up something. And US government officials, I think because of a kind of imperial hubris, a kind of imperial attitude that has been there since at least World War II, just assumed everyone else has to go along with what we say. And this is not a constructive way to engage with the rest of the world, but has defined the way the US government has engaged with the rest of the world for far too long. But this has to change. You know, while I did paint a bleak picture of the world and the threats facing us as a species, as humanity, I think we have to face facts and realize that it is a very bleak picture. That said, you know, there are many encouraging signs. We're in a moment of really unprecedented social movement activism around the world. The kind of outpouring of support for the people of Ukraine is also, I think we have to see as encouraging. The hundreds of thousands of people, millions probably worldwide, who've rallied to support the people of Ukraine, who've come out to protest. This is people power and energy that we can draw upon and need to harness and marshal to take on the real threats that we're facing, rather than, you know, deploying all that energy into an escalation of military tensions and ultimately a wider war that, again, would be beyond catastrophic for the entire globe.
And we've seen a big mobilization everywhere in the world, but we've seen the same mobilization for the Iraq war, for instance, or other wars. It seemed that people doesn't want war. They need to be kind of led or lied into war, as Julian Assange says as well. So there's a lot. We need to be careful and to really think for ourselves. But when a nation like USA is perpetually and constantly at war, then we can say it's a choice, no? Because being all that time in wars, it's not like, oh, we fell into war, you know. If we could avoid it, we would avoid it. But it seems that it's a choice of a state. So you were saying that I've heard you say that we can go back as far as Columbus to understand that. Can you maybe give us more details about that?
Yeah, I agree with you that it is a matter of choice. And generally speaking, it's the matter of choice, the choice of a very small number of government and economic elites, sometimes also elites in the media who help push countries, nations into wars. But which is also to say, and I think that the word choice is important because wars are never inevitable. Even in a country like the United States, where there's such a long history of war, that doesn't guarantee that the United States will continue to fight in that way. In fact, there are many wars, as I show in my book, The United States of War, that the United States avoided waging. So that's important to remember, that there's nothing inevitable or fixed about history or about the future, that we have an opportunity to affect to change and to affect the choices made. But indeed, the reason I begin my book with Christopher Columbus is that I see, and I think we need to see, the long history of US wars as part of a longer history of European wars that actually date to wars in Europe that long predate the independence of the United States, wars that spilled over from Europe itself to the colonization of the Americas, where the empires of Spain and Portugal, France and Britain, Holland as well, waged wars of colonialism to conquer territory and seize lands and natural resources to produce wealth. the United States emerges out of that imperial history and basically takes over from the British Empire in particular, and to a lesser extent, the French Empire, becoming eventually the most powerful empire on earth. Now, sadly, we see how clearly the days of empire are not in the past. The United States remains an empire. Russia clearly, or again, it's important to be specific, Putin has dreams and desires of rebuilding in the Soviet Empire and under clear Russian leadership. And, you know, China as well is a kind of empire. I think we need to, for folks who are concerned about the effects of imperialism and imperial wars, this is all the more reason we need to be pushing for democracy, diplomacy, and peace. Empires, of course, are profoundly undemocratic because they rest on the imposition of force to take from others.
Back to World War II, then after the World War II, if I understand well, the war was won militarily. So they say, okay, so we need to put bases in the losers of the war, Germany and Japan and other places, in order to educate them to democracy, right? Kind of something like that. It's very patronizing and incredible to hear in 2022. So they used to employ a reasoning behind the, oh, we're going to monitor them. But now Germany seems to be more democratic than USA, and they're still there. So what are the rationales for them now to explain these spreading of forces?
There are often many rationales provided for the continuing presence of US bases in Germany or Italy or Japan, South Korea, but I think it's more important to point to what I see as the real reasons, which are political and economic, and sort of a kind of process in which once a base is established, it becomes very difficult to remove because, for example, a base becomes entrenched in a local and a national political economy, which is to say, you know, once there is a US base in Germany, there are some locals who benefit greatly from its presence because they make a living, they have a job on the base, or they have a business that services the base. You develop a whole industry that wants to see that base continue to exist. In addition to people in the United States who want to see the perpetuation of a US military presence in a place like Germany. The rationales often aren't even demanded. It's just taken for granted that there is a large collection of US military bases in Germany and Japan, and people rarely question why they're still there nearly 80 years after the end of World War II. And that's why I undertook the research for my book, Base Nation, and why I wrote the book, to encourage people to question, wait, do we need more than 100 military bases in Germany to this day? Do we need a base in Poland? Does the United States need a base in the middle of the Indian Ocean? What are these bases really doing? Because in addition, of course, to the damage that these bases cause, including the escalation of military tensions with other countries like Russia or China, all the money being poured into these bases, and we're talking about $55 billion every year that the United States is spending just to maintain these bases, $55 billion, which I assume is larger than the entire military budget for most countries on Earth. All that money is money we're not spending to build a green infrastructure. It's money we're not spending to confront and find a solution to climate change, global warming. It's money we're not spending to prevent against the next pandemic or to provide healthcare to the exactly develop new vaccines,
housing people.
exactly.
You name it.
We have this, it's really, again, shameful and embarrassing that the United States has this very robust infrastructure of military bases around the globe. And meanwhile, so much infrastructure in the United States, the housing infrastructure, the availability of affordable housing in the United States, our schools, infrastructure around the world excuse me, infrastructure around the country is crumbling in so many ways, while of course infrastructure and other basic necessities of life around the world for so many people are simply non-existent. In addition to what the United States could be doing in the United States, of course, we could be spending billions of dollars to address global hunger, global inequality, the lack of healthcare in so many parts of the globe.
Yeah, so many things to actually do with all that money, but this critique is great, and the extent of it is the biggest in USA. But we can kind of make the same critique with kind of every nation. And unfortunately, they announced in Switzerland that they're going to increase the military defense budget, and Germany did too. And now every nation in Europe is going to spend more billions on weapons and defense and everything, when we so need money to be used for different crises that are looming and that are actually already here. Where we could, in many countries, they could see the level of the healthcare system that was going down and not being able to actually treat a crisis that could have been worse. I think we were not ready for anything. So it's really a sad development of affair, to be honest.
It's a very sad development, and one we need to oppose before it gets completely out of control. Germany doesn't need to spend more money on its military. Switzerland doesn't need to spend more money on its military. If there are concerns about the Russian military threat, which I acknowledge are understandable, we need to, again, take moments of calm pause and reflection to look at, what are current levels of military spending. The NATO countries together spend far more on their militaries than Russia. The United States alone spends more than the next 10 or 11 countries in the world combined, including Russia. And most of the next 10 or 11 countries that on that list are actually US allies. The NATO alliance spends more and is far better equipped than Russia militarily. There's simply no need to boost military spending at this moment. And that runs the risk of only escalating tensions and encouraging Russia, of course, to spend more on its military. Where does this end? These are the kinds of forces that will lead us into a deeper second Cold War that, again, I fear we will not escape from as a species, that we were lucky enough to live through the first so-called Cold War. I don't think we'll survive another without there being a catastrophic accident, accidental nuclear or a war that potentially could be intentionally launched and become a nuclear one.
The business is not bad for everybody. I've seen the share of Raytheon and all the, what they call the military industrial complex, going very happy lately. Do you think they also play a part in all that?
Absolutely, and that's part of what I point to in my book, The United States of War, that the military industrial complex, so this is actually one of our presidents, President Eisenhower, as he was leaving office in the right before President Kennedy took office in 1960, he warned the country about the emergence of this new source of power, this confluence of power between the military itself, the US military itself, and weapons manufacturers, and actually members of Congress, who had become a source of power that had a power of its own out of the control of any individual. But the military contractors in particular, weapons manufacturers, absolutely play a role in a variety of ways and encouraging war. And we've heard them in recent weeks talking about how a variety of wars are good for their bottom lines. They're good for their profits, good for their share prices. And in the last 20 years of US wars since 2001, indeed, Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, two of the largest US weapons manufacturers, have seen their share prices expand dramatically. And these are some of the forces that are contributing to a more dangerous world, and a world where war is more likely.
The logic seems to be a bit similar with all the big boats, like the pharmaceutical company also took a lot of the share during this crisis, and you're like, instinctively, you're like, can can anybody profit from a crisis that puts everyone to like shame and to suffering? This is really something weird. And what we are talking for now, I don't know, for an hour about that, seems to be reasonable. But when you put that about in the general, I don't know, narrative, then it's like there's an Overton window that is far from that. And if you say what you're saying or what I'm saying, well, people are just calling me, at least, Russian sympathetic or Putin stooge and everything. Do you have this kind of backlash because you are criticizing the other side, the USA?
Thankfully, I haven't faced too much serious critique of that kind, although I think, we don't have to take seriously people who are just, calling you names or
Yeah,
calling
it's
anyone.
mainly on the social media anyway, so it's not
Exactly,
face to
which I think
face.
is often best to avoid. I think we need a serious debate about the actions of the Swiss government or the US government now, rather than this sort of rush to follow what everyone else is doing. Again, this is part of what got the United States into 20 years of horrific, catastrophic wars in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, Philippines, and on, because people turned off their critical thinking skills and just in a moment of fear and a kind of jingoistic nationalism, rushed to support whatever the government said it wanted to do. We need critical thinking now. We need critical reflection. We need debate about the best approach to make the world more peaceful, to bring about an end to the war in Ukraine in particular, and to avoid again a second Cold War that is extraordinarily dangerous and should frighten us all.
So you're a teacher of anthropology in the University of Washington, right? Oh,
Called American University in
okay.
Washington, yes.
And I mean, you are working with other professors and other people. Is your point of view or your analysis shared by many or the majority, or you feel like you are on the fringe?
Happily, I'm not on the fringe. I think there, again, if we're looking for encouraging signs, there are growing critiques of longstanding US military policy that are not just emerging on the left of US politics, which is where I situate myself, but also people on the right. There are conservatives who are anti-imperialist conservatives who think the US government has no business sending its military around the world. And that's one source of encouragement that I take. Similarly, when George W. Bush and his administration led the United States into the wars in Afghanistan,
the so-called war on terror.
Exactly, the so-called war on terror, and led other nations around the world, often pressured other nations around the world to join the US war on terror. There was a large part of the US population that supported those wars. now, after so many people have seen the disasters that those wars became, uh, a, a leader like Biden couldn't launch another large-scale invasion of another country. This is something that should encourage us. This is should give us some hope, because the vast majority of people don't want war, want to find and peaceful solutions and to live in peace. And that's a sign of changing public opinion in the United States and in other countries for that matter. Britain is especially important because of its role in those post-2001 wars.
I'm not a believer that when you watch a channel or media, you believe it. So I guess I'm informed myself on kind of every media. But to be informed, it's critical also to choose at least a number, but the right media who you know are not playing a game or are not joining a camp. And that's quite hard in nowadays. So how do you keep informed? How do you have your information? Well, tell us about that. Maybe it can give some ways for people to maybe look somewhere else to have more nuanced views and point of views.
Yeah, it's very difficult, and I wish I had a good answer. In fact, I'd love suggestions, because often I feel overwhelmed by the amount of news media out there. But I think beginning with ensuring that you get a variety of points of view from many different national sources is important. You know, in Switzerland, the ability of people to get multilingual sources of information and news is wonderful. So if you can get multiple national sources, if you can get multiple language sources, I think that's a good start. And as you said, people from a variety of political perspectives, but it takes work.
It does.
And it's often easier to just consume whatever news media is around, just like we would any other commodity. So it does take a lot of work. I would just on that subject, I hope my research, my writing is helpful and helps inform people. I would just mention, in addition to the website that focuses on the US military presence around the world, the US military base presence around the world, which is basenation.us, where there are maps and other forms of information. I also have a website, davidvine.net.
You know what? davidvine.net. We're going to put them all below in the video description to make sure people can just click it.
Because in both, I have a variety of resources, not just for people to be informed about, you know, the writing that I've done or the other videos I've helped produce, but also there are resources to learn more from other people, other organizations, from social movements, which I think are also very important sources of information and perspective. That is, social movements outside conventional media sources. So I hope that both those websites are a resource to folks around the world.
In USA, though, I think there's a good point. Freedom of speech. It's apparently better protected than here in Europe. And you were talking about the variety of sources, like I do. I mean, the more we see, the more clever we are, because we can then make our own decision. In USA, sorry, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think RT and Sputnik are still working. But in Europe, these channels they had been shut down, which is easy to find them online, but on the main platform, they are gone. And the GAFAM, you know, are also a big part of the censoring in the private social media, but I think in your TV channel, you can still watch RT and Sputnik, or am I wrong?
I don't know, because I don't have cable television.
Okay.
The last time I checked a few days ago, at least online, you could find RT. You know, all of our cable television stations or satellite networks are corporate controlled. We do have some public television stations, but what we call cable networks or cable systems are corporate controlled. So I have my doubts about them.
Yeah. There's too much money involved usually in this big corporation. I'm also very skeptical. But when I watch Russia, it's not because I want to have more, detail to critique Russia. Obviously, I know where to find the critique of Russia. It's not on RT. But I think they do produce good criticism of the West, which we don't get that easily when we look at our media. So I think these hysteria of just cutting information right away says a lot. Also says a lot about the trust the leader puts on the sanity of the people's brain when they watch information. So that's also something I'm aware. But now with internet, we kind of have access anyway to so much information. But as you said earlier, it takes time, it works, and not everybody has this luxury as well. So that's a privilege, and that's also why we make this podcast, to bring about also information that can be useful sometimes, but very interesting for me anyway. So thank you for all your expertise. Did I had another question? Yeah. What drives you? What is your motivation to go on that field and study and research this? Because not a lot of people are doing that. First of all, it's not a very happy place to be or to think about every day. So what is the driver there behind your work?
I mean, everyone has complex motivations that sometimes we're aware of, and we all have motivations that we're not aware of, that we are unaware of. But I think I can point to my own family's history with war. My mother's parents were both German Jews who escaped Germany right before World War II and found refuge in the United States. And without that, I wouldn't be alive today. And I think that has led me, it's played a complicated role in my life, but led me to pay careful attention to the effects of war. And I think led me ultimately to be critical of the US government's actions, while also, of course, appreciating the refuge that the US government provided for parts of my family. But I think my grandparents' experience in the war and suffering the effects of the Nazi Holocaust led me, given that I grew up in a place of extreme privilege. I grew up relatively wealthy and secure and not having to worry about war, at least not immediately, led me to want to make help ensure that my country plays a positive and productive and peaceful role in the world, rather than the opposite, which sadly has been throughout my lifetime been the case. In my lifetime, the US has been involved in a whole series of wars that have taken millions upon millions of lives. And that is to my great shame. And that's something that I will work throughout my life to try to change.
And that's also a reason why of your presence here, because we can see the honesty and the energy you put into your work. And I think that's brilliant to somehow go a little bit against what's expected maybe of a citizen, not to... I agree with you. I mean, I'm very critique of Switzerland, and I think the duty of every citizen is to question power over and over and over and over again all the time. but it's not always easy, but I think that's where we are here for. Yeah, I agree. I'm not asking if you have a crystal ball, but because you've studied the military way of thinking for so long, how do you see the the future unfolding? But saying that is like, oh, are you a magician and tell us the future, you know? But you probably have some thoughts about how things are going
Do you mean in the
to
war in
develop.
Ukraine in particular, or
Yes,
broader
that would
military
be
development?
interesting to hear a little bit of that, maybe short terms, because who knows, you know, what happened tomorrow. I was shocked, to be honest, to witness the invasion, because I'm such a critique of the U.S. propaganda. Then when they were saying they are going to attack tomorrow, this morning, and it didn't happen, then I was like, they're trying something, but bullshit. And then they did. So. I mean, we would be fool to try to make precise, mm, thoughts about what's going to happen. But yeah, so maybe just how you see things, like in the short term period through that conflict, and more globally about your work and the basis.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do think there is going to be growing international pressure on Russia to end the war, and growing, even more importantly, growing support for the people of Ukraine who are suffering the effects, increasingly violent effects of the war, including this Sunday when I think there are going to be protests around the world in support of the people of Ukraine. And so I predict that we will see really hundreds of thousands in some cities alone, but on a global basis, we will see millions of people, as they already have, rising up to support the people of Ukraine and to call for an end to the war. I think in general, there are many reasons why we should be optimistic about the future. Again, I pointed to growing social movements around a range of issues, from global warming and climate change to war, to health, exactly, and affordable housing, that should make us optimistic about the world becoming a more peaceful and more just place. That said, the dangers that we face are profound and very real. And again, given the existence of nuclear weapons, mean that our very existence as a species is at risk. And I hope that we can take advantage of this war in a certain sense of using it to put pressure on the leaders of countries that possess nuclear weapons to give them up once and for all. Because I think this war should show us how much a threat that nuclear weapons and nuclear war represent. That I think many people, like US military bases, have just sort of forgotten, oh yeah, that thousands of nuclear weapons are in existence, and that even just a small number of them could
Obliterate
end.
Earth.
Yeah. And so I think we both need to pay careful attention to the real threats facing us, and feel a great sense of urgency to take on all of the threats that face human beings, and that war, of course, distract us from, again, from the global COVID pandemic to global warming, climate change, and global inequality. We need, with a great sense of urgency, to take on these threats that are damaging and ending so many lives around the world, and give up once and for all the distraction and abomination that war represents.
And this should be just a common sense thing, and everyone should embrace it. Now, maybe about the basis. Do you see a difference between the Biden or Trump behavior, or more generally, the Democrat or Republican behavior when it comes to the development of all these bases around the world?
Sadly, very little. War has been what we call a bipartisan policy. It's been Democrats and Republicans
They
alike
agree on that very much.
yeah, and a lot of that has to do with the economics of war. That the weapons manufacturers, the military contractors, of course, contribute money to members of both parties, as well as sort of the ideology of war in the United States, that war has been turned into something that people see as heroic and a way of serving the nation. And again, I think this actually has to do with the way in which most people in the United States have been insulated from war. The World War II was almost
Always
exclusively
far.
fought in Asia and Europe, far from the United States. And most people in the United States, as a result, think of war in very abstract terms. But so sadly, Democrats and Republicans alike have led the United States into wars and have maintained a policy of maintaining hundreds of US military bases abroad in other countries. So there's been very little change. If anything, President Trump, despite being wrong and horribly wrong about almost everything, was one of the rare politicians to actually question why the United States still has military bases in Germany or South Korea or Japan. And that's a sad thing, that this really horrific individual would be one of the few people to question what has long needed to be questioned.
Yeah, that's quite stunning. Sometimes when I discuss with people and I'm talking about the American imperialism, the end of the discussion is, but do you prefer China as a superpower? That's usually how it ends. And it's hard to see the world becoming more peaceful without at one time a confrontation of the big power and one other power that will win and then become the next empire. Do you see any other exits that are coherent?
I do, and as human beings who care about life on Earth, we need to do everything in our power to avoid any sort of war or confrontation between China and the United States, as well as between the United States and Russia. I think people who would, I think people would say, oh, would you prefer China as the world's superpower? Again, that's a kind of not very serious intellectual argument. It's not particularly intellectual, and is avoiding a serious consideration of US government policy, US war policy. But I think we simply must avoid a war between the United States and China if the human species is to continue to exist on Earth. Even a minor clash between the two wealthiest countries on Earth, between the two largest, most powerful militaries on Earth, could so easily become a war that would spin completely out of control and become a nuclear war. Such a war should be unthinkable. And anyone who thinks or might even want to see such a war is not paying careful attention to the horrific damage that wars inflict. It's important to remember, as we're talking in sort of intellectual terms, people are literally dying in wars around the globe, in Ukraine, in Yemen, in Syria, in Congo. And these are deaths that simply do not have to happen. And I think those of us who have the privilege to do something about it really need to embrace that privilege and do everything we can to make the world a more peaceful place.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we have a little technical problem. Maybe, yeah. Stop. I'm sorry. We kind of lost your image, but not your sound. So yeah, it's kind of stuck. So maybe you can give me a minute, or we're gonna end up closed anyway.
I do need to leave in a moment.
Yeah. I had
attend
just
to a
one last question.
family duty.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, let me find the right thing, and yeah, it worked all the way, and then something happened. It's okay. I think we had it go. We had it well. No, you froze actually.
Oh, weird.
Yeah. So we can still hear your voice. So I think we're going to leave it here. It means what it means. It means that, you know, had a very good time. Thank you very much for sharing all these wise analysis, and for all the work that you're doing. I will put all the links of your websites on the description, and that's all. Do you want to add something maybe to close up?
No.
But we won't see you anymore because I don't have the
right.
skills to like that find a solution.
That's quite all right. I would just merci beaucoup, Antoine, and thank you for doing what you're doing to bring critical perspectives to not just to Switzerland, but to people around the world. We need more of it, and I appreciate yeah, the fantastic questions, and just wish there were more people who were asking so many critical questions. And I, yeah, thank you. I deeply appreciate your inviting me onto your show.
Thank you for enduring my poor English. I hope it was not that bad. And we'll hear from you. Good luck with the rest.
No, j'ai honte about my my French, let alone, you know, I'm sure you speak at least 5 languages.
No, it's not. It's like it's a myth. It's like every Swiss has money in his bank account. No, we don't all speak like 5 languages.
You don't speak Romanche?
No, not this one.
Okay.
A little bit of German, English, and French, and that's way enough for me. Well, I wish I can learn Spanish maybe one day. Thank you, David Wine, for your time again, and I wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Merci, Dankeschön. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.